Okie doke. Well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. This is February 13th, lucky 13. So we're going to start out as per normal, going to talk about the news of the week. And then we're going to jump in with some announcements of upcoming webinars and the like. And then we're going to hit on a topic of discussion. And this week's topic of discussion is essentially what the utility of the future is going to look like, some of the issues and why we're not ready for that. I saw some interesting articles in the press, so I thought we'd touch on those. I'm Jay Warmke with Blue Rock Station, and let's go ahead and jump into this. Okay, well, one of the oldest ways of heating using energy, stored energy, is new again. If anybody's ever gone camping or whatever and you heat up a rock and put it inside the tent, this is kind of the idea that we're dealing with, where a company called Rondo Energy has announced plans to do a large scale thermal storage facility, basically a gigawatt factory of sorts for thermal storage. They're going to use excess electricity from wind and solar, heat up bricks, rocks, these kind of things, and they're heating them up quite hot. I mean, they're getting to about 1,000 degrees Celsius, and these things will give off heat at very high temperatures for 16 to 18 hours. And what they're looking at doing is using this to power industrial systems. And these industrial systems have been traditionally very difficult to transition over to renewable energy because they use a lot of energy, a lot of heat. For example, making cement, chemical processes, smelting of ore, like aluminum or steel. And so this process has promise for those. It's about 90% efficient. So 100% going in, you get about 90% of the energy coming out. Currently, Rondo Energy has a 2 megawatt facility located in California, sort of as a test system. And they're looking at gearing this thing up. They've raised about $80 million so far for this gigawatt factory. And this thing is supposed to have the capacity about 2.5 times Tesla's big lithium ion gigawatt factory in Nevada. There's some legislation that's been introduced called Big Wires. I guess that's the nickname for it. Introduced in the Senate by Senator John Hickenlooper from Colorado, Democrat, and then in the House by Representative Scott Peters. He's a Democrat from California. And what they're doing here is they're requiring that RTOs, regional transmission organizations, have the capacity to transmit up to 30% of their peak load. And what they're trying to obtain here is a more resilient grid nationwide. The bigger the system is, the more resilient it is. For example, if there's excess power in one area of the country, needs it in another area, you want to be able to transmit that power across these authorities. And that's proven to be difficult in the past. So they're requiring this. This is going to require that they build up inter-regional transmission by about doubling it in most cases. Although Texas is always the odd one out on all of this. Its organization or its region RTO ERCOT really only has about 1.2 gigawatt of transmission authority, and they need to upgrade to about another 12.5. So basically 10 times what they currently have is what's going to be required to meet this legislation. Sunday's Super Bowl played in Las Vegas at for some reason, Allegiant? Yeah. Allegiant. Okay, that's Allegiant Stadium. Shows how up I am on these things. Anyway, this was the first Super Bowl powered by 100% renewable energy. The Super Bowl uses a lot of power in that facility. For that 5-hour period of time, it uses about 10 megawatts of power. That really translates to about 11,000 suburban homes for a month. So a month's worth of power for 11,000 homes. is used within the stadium during the 5-hour period of the Super Bowl. And in 2019, Allegiant Stadium, they went into a power purchase agreement to go 100% renewable from surrounding wind and solar plants. So sign of the times to come. And USA Today, they did an investigative report piece, and they found that about 15% of all of the counties in the country have effectively banned large-scale wind and solar projects within their jurisdictions. This is done through outright bans, through moratoriums, and through rules that are just absurd. For example, one county said, if you want to install a wind turbine, it's got to be set 5 miles back from the property line. So, that's obviously not going to happen. For example, there in 2023, there are 411 counties that have banned large wind projects. In 2009, wind was banned in 23 of the 100 counties in North Carolina. In 2014, Kentucky effectively banned wind all across the state. Vermont followed suit in 2017, banning large-scale wind. And in 2018, Tennessee banned about 91 out of 95 of the counties. And in the world of utility scale solar, to date, there are about 116 counties nationwide that have banned large scale solar. The opponents to large scale solar and large scale wind claim that these developments disrupt the rural way of life. They create environmental damage, they lower property values. But the developers and people in favor of these systems say that's all nonsense. It's been debunked, and that a lot of these anti-programs are funded by fossil fuel interests. So we'll see how that plays out. And Energy Hub, in partnership with Ontario's Independent Electrical Systems Operator, that's the RTO up there, have signed up more than 100,000 subscribers in about 6 months as part of their virtual power plant program that they're calling Peak Perks. And what they're doing, and well, this ultimately is the largest virtual power plant that exists in the country. They can actually curtail about 90 megawatts of load demand during peak load demand periods. And the way this is set up, the residential customers, they sign up for this program. They allow the utility to come in through their thermostat and adjust the temperature plus or minus 2 degrees Celsius for up to 3 hours. And they can only do that 10 times a year. So it's not overly intrusive. And in exchange for this, the utility gives them a $75 and $20 a year for continuing with the program. But they're also then give them a little energy savings kit that's got LED and light bulbs and weather stripping. And I thought it was interesting. They mentioned they give them a clothesline, which is very low tech there. And they also give them free air conditioner tune-up on their facility. So that's kind of where these utilities are moving towards, saying, how can we begin to create these virtual power plants? And this one is dealing with load. As we'll see a little bit later in the discussion, there's also using batteries to create supply. And that's the news from the solar industry for this week. Does anybody have anything they ran across or want to add to this particular segment here? Give you just a second to chime in. All right, then let me get into, yeah, Bill?
Real quickly, I wonder why the why the thermal storage is using, I mean, I guess you can heat rocks as high as you want to heat them. I mean, that's, yeah, thousands of degrees. I wonder about if any of these people are using phase change materials.
Phase change. What are you meaning by
Well,
that?
phase change for storing thermal energy, but it would be a lot lower storage temperatures than what they're having here.
Such as
well, Glauber salt was an old one that we used back in the thermal days. I wondered if there's anybody else working on phase change that's effectively using thermal energy as opposed to, I mean, there's ice energy that's doing ice. And then there's a number of them that are using chilled water as thermal storage as well for air conditioning loads.
Yeah. Well, of course, that's almost just a geothermal kind of thing using a heat exchange process. Is that what you're talking about primarily?
Well, it can be done. It can be done with geothermal, or it can be just stored thermal energy, but it's not at temperatures that these guys are talking about. Certainly not industrial scale. I mean, usually those are contained in plastic plates of various sizes. So no, it's probably not. It's not the temperatures that these guys are talking about.
Well, I know that concentrated solar programs use that kind of idea of taking concentrated solar rays and storing it in heat in the form of highly heated liquid salts and
Uh huh.
things like that, and then taking and doing a heat exchange process. And there's just one big concentrated solar utility that's out in Arizona, I think. But this is something that people are talking about on residential scale. Of course, there's been sandbanks and other type of passive solar type systems, or even I always call them throm walls, but some people call them trombe walls. I'm not quite sure the term, but that's another thing that you can do there. So none of this is new stuff. Like I said, it's almost like native cultures just heating up rocks and bringing them into the tent or into the cave. It's taking heat and energy when you have it and then using it later as a heat source. This is just highly scaled. So
Well, it's certainly cheaper concrete, especially old concrete, whether it's old curbs and streets or whether it's certainly cheaper than lithium.
yeah, that's true. Okay. Anybody else have anything they want to add to the mix there? I just noticed while we were talking
Bill,
there. Yeah,
I was just say that to add to what Bill had said, um, I do recall it's maybe been a couple of years, but I saw a presentation where a gentleman had basically built a large tank, basically making a heat exchanger where he froze ice, well, froze water, so he was storing frozen water, ice, obviously, and then using that for his air conditioning throughout the day. So I guess basically freezing a bunch of, making a bunch of ice and then able to pull from that throughout the day. So with his excess solar, it was quite a big operation. I don't think it makes sense for most people. This was an off-grid guy, but I just to add to what Bill had said, I have seen that in use before. I think it's pretty neat, but it's not for the average homeowner.
Mhm.
And then also I saw, I don't have a reference, but it was just something that I saw. It looks like out west where they have those snow fences. I know they have them out in, think in Colorado. I've seen them out there. It looks like they're doing some PV snow fences, which the efficacy of that in my mind is kind of confusing because it seems like if it's going to be covered in snow half the year, I don't know how it could be efficient. Um, but I guess they are testing it anyway. So
Mhm. Yeah, that sounds good. And you'll get certainly a lot of albedo, reflection
yeah,
coming off the snow surface.
yeah, exactly. Yep. Yep.
Okie doke. All right. Well, let me jump in. And of course, as anybody else has any comments, feel free to jump in. The upcoming webinars, we've got solar design in 3 dimensions. This is for ground mounted systems. This is actually today, later on today, I think at 2 p.m. Eastern time. All these times are Eastern. So it's talking about doing tracking systems and the like over uneven ground. That's always a big issue for large systems. The 15th, we have a 2 p.m. And that's selling solar using artificial intelligence. And then on the 15th at 7 p.m., this is through Solar United Neighbors, helping nonprofits go solar. So if you're interested in this, I think you'll get some good information about how the investment tax credits now work for nonprofit organizations and governmental bodies, how they can access that. February 20th at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, how to do cost reduction for solar companies, tips for reducing your operating costs. The 20th at 2 p.m., recruiting and retaining veterans in solar. And then on the 22nd at 2 p.m., there is a Clean Energy Apprenticeship Program webinar put on by IREC. That's coming up. And then, of course, March 18th through the 21st, there's NABCEP conference. That's coming up in Raleigh, North Carolina. So those are always good if you're really serious about this industry and want to spend some serious dosh going down there and hanging out with folks. And then, of course, our reminders that the solarpvtraining.com website has some in-person classes coming up throughout Ohio and also West Virginia. And then we also have online courses that are available all the time. And those were the announcements that crossed my desk. I'll throw it open one more time. Anybody else have anything that popped up in your inbox that I did not mention that you're going to be participating in or attending? Give me just a second there. All right. Well, okay. So I'm going to jump in here and talk about something that's I find interesting. And since I'm putting these together, if I find it interesting, maybe you will. But the utility of the future and how everything in the utility of the future is about to change. We're undergoing some seismic changes there, and we really aren't ready for it. There's a lot of discussion in governmental bodies and also in the media. But I just get this feeling that everything moves at such a glacial pace that it's going to be upon us, and we're just not ready for it. Even the folks, like us who are really anticipating this, we're not going to be ready for it either. So if we just to back up a little bit, look at how the grid operates, so that you understand how these things are going to be changing. Of course, the old joke is that if Alexander Graham Bell came back and looked at the communication system of today, he'd see wireless communication, data, satellites, cell phones, he'd be absolutely amazed. And if Thomas Edison came back and looked at the grid, he'd say, hey, those transformers are getting kind of old. You might want to upgrade. So, it really hasn't changed that much. But it's certainly about to. When we look at the way that the grid operates typically and historically, there is a large centralized generating facility. It then goes through transmission lines and ends up going to some sort of transmission substation. So these are the very high voltage power lines that take things over long distances. Can be 700,000 volts, for example, going there. They then go from this transmission distribution system to more area distribution substations. These substations can feed out to industry, to large users through a network, but we're focused a little bit more here on residential. So they'll often then feed to an area smaller distribution substation, and then it goes out through overhead transmission and ends up at your resident. So the analogy I always think of here is like an old-fashioned computer system where you have a mainframe computer and a whole bunch of dummy terminals. And our houses are the dummy terminals. Our businesses are dummy terminals, right? They simply receive this energy coming in, and it's kind of a one-way process. So that's the way the system has been dealt with in the past, and it's all been vertically integrated, where the utility company owns or controls the mode of generation, the mode of distribution, and is always simply reacting to loads, reacting to load demands. But those load demands are fairly predictable, don't change that much. So, occasionally you run into trouble with a high, a heat wave coming in August, and all of a sudden the whole system's strained because people don't have access to the power. So they use rolling blackouts and things of that nature to deal with it. So that's been the way that we've operated in the past. So what's about to change here? Well, one of the movements of the industry, both from an environmental standpoint and from a technology standpoint, is we're moving towards electrifying everything. So we're seeing people trying to move from fossil fuel-based heating and cooling systems to electric. That in and of itself would increase demand fairly significantly. So as we move towards this electrifying everything, well, that only works if a significant portion of what's supplying that electricity is renewable energy or non-polluting energy. Otherwise, we're just sort of putting an intervening step in. For example, if you used natural gas power plants to make electricity versus burning natural gas as a heat source, it doesn't really solve any problem. In fact, it inserts inefficiency into the system. So that's one thing that's just happening and happening organically and through policy. Then there's the adoption of electric vehicles. Now, the electric vehicle market, although I think we're going to see it increasingly politicized, but we are seeing that the federal government has invested through the Infrastructure Act $7.5 billion in charging station infrastructure. The goal is from the Biden administration that 50% of all new vehicles will be EVs by the year 2030. Already in 2024, they're anticipating that 10% of all of the cars sold, all the light vehicles sold in the United States will be electric vehicles. And in 2023, there were 1.2 million EVs sold in the country. So we're seeing this movement towards electric vehicles. And as you'll see, that's going to put increasing demands on the grid. Integration of renewables. Once again, as we talked about, we're seeing wind and solar added into the mix, and no longer do the utilities control all of the means of production for electricity. There's a need for data-driven power, and I'll touch a little bit more on that. The integration of artificial intelligence into these systems and how that's going to change everything that we're dealing. Increased cybersecurity risks as everything becomes digital through this process. Everything is interactive. It's essentially one big electric computer network. So that increases vulnerabilities at a lot of different levels. Then there's a movement towards virtual power plants. During the news, I mentioned that one up in Ontario as an example, but there are others that are popping up all over the place. Demand management, that's a big issue within utilities, so we'll touch on that. And then I'll close with what virtual utilities. So anyway, so the demand is about to really go forward here in a big way. If we look at the annual generation or the demand here that in the US grid, it's had a relatively steady growth rate, really from about 1950 to the year 2000 or so. The growth rate was fairly predictable, fairly straight line. But if you look at this since 2000 to 2020, it's been pretty steady. You know, the growth has been offset by energy savings. We've seen LED lights adopted. We've seen energy efficiency measures put into place. So that's tended to level out the electric demand within the US grid. But now when we project out, NREL has put in some projections here, and you look over the next 30 years, and if we look at that high demand, largely driven by electric vehicles, there would be some demand growth anyway, with or without EVs. But with EVs, we're really looking at, almost, well, certainly more than a 50% growth in the electrical generation demands over the next 30 years or so. And that is historic, and I don't think that the infrastructure is anywhere near ready to deal with that kind of growth. Just for example, integrating in electric vehicles. Well, we're talking about all these all these car companies are coming out with their EVs. Well, what about the charging structure? And there are a lot of different aspects to this. NREL is estimating we're going to need about 500,000 public charging stations by 2030. And that brings into question who owns these charging stations. How are these charging stations going to be marketed? Where are they going to be deployed? Are they going to be owned by utilities? Are they going to be owned by private investors like ChargePoint, for example? Or are the auto manufacturers going to come together and try to own these systems? Are they going to be proprietary? Are they going to be cooperative? You know, obviously for a network like this, it wouldn't work if every single car company wants to have their own charging protocols, their own plugs, their own everything. It'd be almost like you got to buy gasoline that only works in a Toyota as opposed to working in every single vehicle. So that's an issue that is being ironed out as we speak, and we've had some shows on that. But it definitely has a lot of issues associated with it. For example, the utilities are in a situation to put their finger on the scale of competition, since they're the ones who are providing the power, and their structure of billing with demand charges and the like can really make these things unaffordable to private operators. So some of the legislation is looking at, should utilities be allowed to develop these? Should they be allowed to own them? Should they, if they are not allowed to own them, at what point does their ownership end? Because they've got to bring the infrastructure up to them, or will they? Because the utility structure might change dramatically. So this is some of the issues that are going to be dealt with there. I found this particular diagram here from NREL was kind of interesting, you know, kind of cute with the tree analogy. But basically, they're saying that if in fact we do have 33 million EVs on the road, which is really what they're projecting here by 2030, you're going to need over 1 million public level 2 charging stations. So where are these going to be? Who's going to own them? How are you going to access them? Are they going to be at convenience stores, at malls, if malls exist, at movie theaters, at Walmarts, whatever? Then there's going to need to be about 180,000 or more of these high-speed DC fast charging, or the level 3 charging stations. And these are more along high traffic corridors, interstate highways and the like, where you just pull in for 20 minutes and you get a 80% charge or whatever. But though that's a very expensive proposition. In fact, they were estimating that just to put in that 182,000 fast chargers, we're going to cost about $27 to $44 billion just for those. In fact, the entire infrastructure investment for charging stations is going to be around $127 billion. So where's this coming from? I mean, the Infrastructure Act was pretty generous with this, and they allocated $7.5 billion. That's a drop in the bucket. So this has to come from private investment for sure. And of course, the lion's share, the 26 million plus charging ports, are going to be in offices, in homes. You know, they're level 1, level 2 situations. So there's a lot of infrastructure there. I know personally with our plug-in hybrid, it came with the level 1. It's kind of, you know, that's the 120 outlet kind of thing, an extension cord to plug the thing into. Takes a long time, not very practical. It's all right if you're going to charge overnight and you don't drive very much. But the level 2, well, you know, that's an investment. At minimum, you're going to spend $700-800 just to get a charging station there. And some of these others, like the ones that work with the Ford Lightning, I've heard $7,000-8,000 to get that charging station. And how many people are going to be able to have that kind of money to devote to that. And this works again if you have a garage or property, you know, where you can put in a charging station. But what if you live in an urban environment where you're parking on the street? How do we deal with the charging infrastructure there? So these are all big issues, and they're not issues that are going to be solved very, very quickly. And we're talking about this coming in 2030 in a significant way. And right now here we're sitting in 2024. That's only 6 years. I mean, shoot, the socks I have on are probably 12 years old. So, you know, that's it. It happens quick. It happens quicker as you get older. And of course, then of course, there's the integration of renewable energy. How much and how much control are the utilities going to have on all of this? And we can see from the projections, of course, that by 2050, we're really looking at about half the grid, pretty much, coming from renewables. I think it's going to happen quicker. NREL and government bodies are always notoriously slow in projecting these transitions. But perhaps some of the infrastructure interconnectivity, things of that nature may slow things down. But if left to market devices, it's going to happen very, very quickly, with solar taking the lion's share of that. Well, now you've got utilities that are dealing not from a perspective of we control and operate all of the means of generation. Now they're dealing with utility scale systems that are not owned by them. So they're feeding into the grid in unpredictable ways or less predictable ways. There's behind the meter utility scale systems for larger consumers. There's thousands and thousands of smaller systems put on rooftops. So all of these in some way or another are connected to the grid and feeding into the grid in different ways and in different fashions. And so now we begin to require a great deal of data and a great deal of management of these systems. So fortunately, since our utility companies haven't shown any real intelligence for a lot of decades, artificial intelligence steps in. So how are some of the ways artificial intelligence right now is being used to try and deal with this? Because artificial intelligence, of course, is one of those industries like renewable energy in that regard, that's in such an infancy stage that we almost cannot predict the ways that it's going to impact how we do business, how things operate. I think it's going to be transformative. How long it takes to be that transform that is anybody's guess. So right now they're using it to detect EV locations and the charging habits of people. So it gets back to that kind of old thing where you cannot control a thing until you can measure a thing. So they need to know, where are these electric vehicles located and how are people charging them? That's easily done through artificial intelligence. And then what they're beginning to do is say, okay, well, we see a certain number of these people with EVs and they're charging them during peak load demand times. So why don't we do a targeted marketing thing to those folks and say, hey, we want to change your behavior because you're actually putting a huge load onto the grid right at the absolute worst time for that load to come onto the grid. So in those cases, now we're seeing utilities moving towards a time of use pricing structure. In a lot of states, this has been around for a while, but in many states and many locations, it's not, but it's coming. And just as a little refresher, time of use pricing is essentially acknowledging that electricity doesn't cost the same if it's used, at different times of the day. It costs more. So for example, in the middle of the night, when demand is low, they run their lowest cost generators And so electricity is relatively cheap. But in the middle of a hot afternoon, all of their generators are running, the low cost, the medium cost, the high cost. And in many times they have to go outside and purchase power from somewhere else. And that gets more and more and more expensive. So they're saying, okay, there are times when the electricity costs us more to generate, we should charge more for that. And then by charging different rates, we're going to change your behavior to use power when it's cheap and don't use it so much when it's expensive. And as those habits change, we're going to change which times we charge more for and things like that. And of course, the integration of solar onto the grid changes things from the middle of the afternoon being peak load to basically as soon as the sun goes down. That's usually peak load time period. So all of this stuff shifts and changes. Now, one thing I haven't read about, but I really think that this is going to become a thing because just to back up to get to the point, the original time of use pricing usually did low demand, medium demand, high demand, and they just broke the day into these 3 chunks of time. California has recently passed legislation to say we want to do second by second aggregate time of use pricing. So we won't be able to tell you how much your power is going to cost until we know what kind of demand is happening at that real time moment. So that's going to change the way things operate, and they're going to have to build in intelligence there in order for it to really function in any meaningful way. So your appliances are going to have to be able to read these grid signals to modify because it's going to be changing constantly. I think we're going to get into personalized time of use pricing so that it's not system wide, it's based on your behavior to try and modify behavior to even out the load. Because some people's time of use, load use is different. So I really see that these utilities are going to get to such a granular level that they can essentially begin to try and individually modify individual consumers' behavior. And that's going to require a lot of artificial intelligence on all sides. And then they're looking at creating infrastructure based on this data, because right now I suspect they just sort of throw a dart at a board and say, yeah, we're seeing a lot of growth up here in this particular area. We probably should put more lines in because we anticipate this number of houses or this factory or whatever. But it's all very speculative. So, who's putting in EVs? Who's going all electric? Who's doing all of this? Let's combine, let's use all that data, and let's begin to deal with infrastructure upgrades, infrastructure expansion based on data rather than hunches. So that's something that artificial intelligence is going to have to deal with. And then, of course, we get into demand management, virtual power plants. All of these things are going to require artificial intelligence built into the system because it's got to manage these things on a real-time basis. Okay, I'm going to take just a second here in my diatribe here to see if anybody's got any comment so far before I jump into the next slide. Take a pause just to let you guys. Okay. I must be explaining this very well.
Yeah, I have a
All
comment.
right. Yeah. Okay, Tim. Yep.
How you doing today? Great. Hey, listen. So, it comes up to asking a lot of questions. What can we do? What's being done? I'm curious. What country is using the most amount of EV
Oh, which one is using the most amount of EV?
per capita? I guess.
Yeah, it seems to me I saw, and this is just going with a vague memory, that some of the European countries are adopting pretty quickly. Yeah, somebody just threw in Norway. I think Norway is far and away the leader there. Germany is catching up, I know.
Do we know what they're doing? How are they dealing with their demand?
Oh, how they're dealing with the demand cycles?
Right, since they're kicked in a little bit more.
They probably have a lot of hydro, which is variable. You can match it. You can release water depending on load.
Yeah. I would also say too that many of these European nations, their utility system is one system and it's owned and operated by the government. So, you know, I think it's less of a coordination issue. It's more about how to implement policies that the government has put in place. And so I suspect it's a little more coordinated than our hodgepodge and mismatch of different systems trying to work together. So.
It's something to look into. I'm going to look into it for sure.
Okay, well, that's good. Yeah, we'll get you to report back. You can be
All
our
right,
fearless
you got it.
reporter out there. All right. So I mentioned about virtual power plants here. So I don't want to take the assumption that everybody knows what we're talking about. A virtual power plant is, I thought I had a zoom in on that. It's essentially saying, okay, we've got a power plant. It's a coal operated power plant, a natural gas operated power plant, and that generates a certain amount of electricity. So let's say it's 100 megawatt power plant. Well, a virtual power plant could either be generation based or demand managed. For example, in the news, when I was talking about this place up in Canada where they're saying, okay, we want to be able to control your thermostats. And we can reduce by aggregating this demand and reducing it when we need to. It's effectively a 90 megawatt power plant because they can just turn off 90 megawatts of demand instantly, which would be effectively the same as turning on a 90 megawatt power plant to meet that demand. So that's a load managed type power plant. Another one that's happening, for instance, in North Carolina that I reported on last week is they're saying, okay, we're going to give you $9,000 each residential customer to install batteries with your solar on your homes. All we ask is that we have the ability to pull a certain amount of that power from them when load demands are high. So rather than go out and build another 100 megawatt power plant, they're saying, okay, we've got all of these batteries out there, and cumulatively, they represent, let's just say, 1,000,000 megawatts, and we're only going to take 10% of it or whatever. So that's power that we can pull. It's a virtual power plant. And we can do that instantaneously, once again, because electricity flows in both directions. Then the ultimate virtual power plant is going to be these 30 million EVs that are all connected to the grid. They have massive batteries in them. And if we could pull power from those 30 million vehicles while they're all plugged into a charging station, you have a tremendous virtual power plant. So, but who owns it? How is that going to be managed? Tesla is trying to create these virtual power plants through the Tesla vehicles. I think a lot of the manufacturers are going to say, hey, we'll give you some charging stations if you allow us to create these virtual power plants. You know, utilities may do the same thing. They can deal with load management from that, so they can turn off EV charging during periods of high demand, but they can also draw from the vehicle and create a vehicle to grid situation where that's upgrading and supporting. So it's a combination of all these different systems, virtual power plants. That's where we're coming from, a load demand side and a generation side. And then of course there's even now, for instance, Enphase just announced with their charger, their vehicle charger, it's not bi-directional, but they can do it like a load dump, where they're saying that your vehicle's only going to charge when we have excess solar power coming into your home to charge your vehicle. We're not going to be charging it from the grid. We're only going to charge it from the excess. And so it's going to take longer, but you're now not buying power from the utility to charge your EV, but you're also not sending power back to the utility as much until your vehicle is full. So it's essentially a load dump. So that's what the virtual power plant is. And I guess one of the things that I would mention with these virtual power plants, and there's going to be a big part of the solution here, that North Carolina pilot that I mentioned, they're anticipating a 10-year pilot program for this virtual power plant. Well, 10 years, the problem is going to be upon us in a couple of years. So I think all of these utilities who have used to working at such a glacial pace are saying, well, let's study the problem for 10 years. You know, in 10 years, either it's solved or it's insolvable. You know, so these things have to happen very quickly. And I just don't think the utilities, as we currently envision them, have the corporate philosophy or mindset to react fast enough to essentially disrupt their own business in such a way that's going to be necessary to make these solutions. You know, it's really the Silicon Valley kind of mindset of blow up everything, you know, tear it apart, rebuild it, you know, that's going to have to be here in this environment. Bill, I see a question there. Yep, you're still muted there. There you go.
It's interesting how this augurs into the story that you talked about just a little bit ago with the different counties blocking centralized solar and wind. It almost forces distributed solar to happen in those locations because otherwise there will not be the capacity available locally to be able to do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's ultimately a very self-defeating process. You know, you get these counties where they're you know, they have these citizen get-togethers, and if you've ever been in any of these meetings, these are not always the sharpest pencils in the box, and they're going, the solar is killing birds and it's setting off x-rays and causing my chickens to be sterile and whatever else they're doing. In fact, it's amazing because when I was at a utility scale place last week and we're dealing with one of the guys who works there, and he said, well, you know, these solar panels, and he started looking around, he goes, you know, they cause cancer. And I'm going, how exactly? And he goes, oh, they give off stuff. And I said, well, you know what? And this is a guy who works there. And I'm going, not really. They kind of absorb stuff. They don't so much give off stuff. And I said, maybe you're thinking about, you know, some of these thin film panels. Of course, these were all silicon panels where we're at. They do have traces of cadmium in them, and cadmium is a cancer-causing agent. I said, but you pretty much have to eat the panels, you know, in order to get this. And he seemed surprised by that. You know, it's like it's just sort of matter of fact. So, yeah, so they're taking a potential economic boon and saying we don't want any part of it. Well, that's fine. There will be places that will take advantage of that. But I think, as you say, Bill, you're sort of moving this to a more granular, you know, like I think these utility scale systems are an interim step, you know, where you're going from large coal power plants to large solar and wind plants, and eventually we've got to get to more distributed, smaller, more localized. You know, the rooftop solar type idea has got to be eventually the ultimate solution. So
Now, the rural electrics have the possibility of, I mean, typically a rural electric cooperative will have 2 transmission nodes that feed it. And they also have buyback meters. So it really is a matter for them to simply put in a couple of big buyback meters at the transmission nodes. And it's basically the same as the gas collection system for natural gas.
mm-hmm.
I mean, they could sell and market this through their same contract, and it could just be a large PPA.
Yep. Yeah, Chet, I see you got your hand up there. You're muted as well, Chet. You're still muted there. All right. I'm going to talk while you try and unmute there.
There you go.
There you are. There you are.
Okay, sorry. This is about the Lorraine Medina Rural Electric Cooperative. They have been harping about how much generation capacity we've been losing. And so their recommendation for that is actually for people to buy generators, natural gas or diesel generators. So the solution, unfortunately, when left to its own devices, you know, that's what's going to happen is people are going to just start going out and buying generators.
Yep. I think you're right. And right now it's not a bad economic decision to do so because they're so much cheaper than going out and doing your own solar array. But that's going to change. You know, everything changes as economics change, and it's not really a solution anyway. It's a temporary emergency basis kind of thing. But I mean, obviously, we're all here. We're all solar geeks, and we're in favor of solar. But most people view it as you still get, oh, solar, it's too expensive. It's not practical. It doesn't, it doesn't operate, and we know all of that is changing. But I think the problems again, they're coming at us fast, and we're just still debating solutions when the solutions need to already be in place. One of these items here is that's required is the data-driven end of it, where we're seeing the grid become digitalized. We're looking at this and saying, okay, we need data. We need data. This is the world of big data. And just for example, this last week, my rural electric co-op installed finally a meter that they can read remotely. Up until then, I had to go out to the meter and write down on my bill, how much I was using. So these companies are not exactly high tech in their approach, and that has to change. They have to be able to visualize the grid in real time, and they currently cannot do that. It's hard to imagine, but for example, I toured the Cardinal power plant, which my rural electric company uses, and it literally is Soviet era technology. If you go into that power plant, there's still analog dials, and it looks like you just walked onto an old James Bond movie set when Sean Connery was James Bond. I mean, it's old technology. They need to upgrade on that. They need to integrate distributed energy into this system in a real-time way. They need to integrate electric vehicles in a real-time way. How do we do that? But it all has to be interoperable. You can't have proprietary solutions, either utility scale proprietary or EV manufacturer proprietary. All of these things, it's got to kind of be open source. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. And of course, the interregional transmission is going to help. It spreads the risk over a larger area, and that's a good thing. But all of these things, the digitalization of it, really is going to be critical to make this work. And when we're talking about digitalization, that brings into effect cybersecurity risks. I mean, cybersecurity risks are just going to be huge. Now you've got this digital platform, interconnected, accessible. Who's going to be in charge of cybersecurity on the electrical grid? Is it the people who are making the products, like charging stations, inverters for solar, for example? Or is it going to be the utility? How do we put in these firewalls? Is it the automaker who's in charge of cybersecurity? Where is the demarcation point? Who's going to be liable? All of these kind of issues, because it's going to happen, right? And it's not just some nefarious terrorist type thing who goes in and says, I can disrupt the grid, or I can disrupt this house, or I can turn these things on or off or cause havoc. But we saw, for instance, Enron, back when they were operating, manipulating marketplaces. Well, we're already seeing that time of day pricing, the higher the load demand, the higher the cost. Well, if you can come in and artificially manipulate that market, you can make some serious money, by jumping in on that. So that kind of thing of manipulating the data is going to be a big issue. And of course, If they're manipulating load and supply demand, then you're going to see cascading failures going on throughout the system. It's a mess. So how are we going to deal with that? That's an unknown question. Just sort of close off because we're running out of time here, but I really feel that ultimately where we're going to end up, and in the not too distant future, is the Silicon Valley guys are going to come in and they're going to become the dominant players in the electric utility marketplace. Companies like Apple and Google and Meta and Microsoft. I mean, all of these guys have the artificial intelligence, platforms to operate from. They've got cash. They've got a philosophy of marketplace disruption, of responding quickly. Already, all of these companies are registered as utilities with the federal government. They're all anticipating this. They all have large internal demand for electricity. So why wouldn't they get into the place? And ultimately, for example, as the utilities make it more and more difficult for us to sell power back to them, they're moving to that wholesale versus retail kind of thing, where we buy it retail, but they buy it wholesale. Marketplaces are going to develop that allow us to sell to each other through a third-party platform. For instance, Apple. And I've used this example before where Apple puts on their phone an app, the iPower app. And if Chet has extra power in his system and he doesn't want to sell it back to First Energy or AEP because they're giving him a crappy price, he can put that onto the marketplace. Apple facilitates the transaction and I can buy that power, or anybody can buy that power. And does it need to be within a utility or does it need to be universal? Who knows? But I think these marketplaces will develop, just like companies like PayPal went in and disrupted the banking industry. And today I can do international transfers of funds just by clicking it on my computer, and I don't have to go through all of that nonsense that the banking industry put in place. I think we're going to see companies like Apple or Google or Meta coming in and completely changing the way we view utilities, where the utilities become more of a social network as opposed to something restrained by geography. And that in and of itself is going to be just astounding. What are the market implications? Are we going to see a regulated side of the industry versus a deregulated side of the industry? And how is that transition going to take place? And we know these companies got money and they can get legislation passed. So all of this is going to happen, and it's going to happen quick. All right, so I've wandered on this, and I think normally I open it up for questions, but I think we're only a minute or two up to the hour here. So I'm going to call it a day here and thank everybody for joining, and we'll see you guys all next week. All right, take care. Bye-bye.